He who leaves without noise takes all the power with him. Have you ever felt that the more you help, the more you disappear? That as you give of yourself, you lose the outline of your own name until all that's left is the shadow of who you were? Why can the silence of a kind person be more cruel than the scream of a tyrant? And what if the greatest revenge isn't an act, but an absence? What if the darkest justice is simply to stop being available? Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Gustav Jung. There is a wound that doesn't show up in medical exams, but which drains the body and shatters the soul. It is born slowly in the everyday gestures of someone who learned early on that to love is to sacrifice yourself, that to care is to disappear, that to help is to silence your own pain. That wound has a name. Being an empath in a world that sucks up emotional energy as if it were oxygen. You've been there, in the listening position while everyone else was screaming for help, in the role of comforter while no one noticed your silent collapse, in the skin of someone who feels too much and was therefore unconsciously chosen to carry the weight that others cannot bear. But the bill always comes. It happens on an ordinary night. You are lying in bed, but something inside you won't sleep. It's no longer sadness. It's an old, viscous exhaustion that rest can't fix. It's a scream that won't come out, a truth you've avoided for too long. You've become a function, not a person. Carl Jung called this psychic containment. You have become the vessel where others pour their shadows, fears, rages, and frustrations. And no, it wasn't by chance. It was because you allowed it. It was because, like so many of us, you confused empathy with obligation, compassion with servitude, and love with self-abandonment. But a point comes where the soul stops accepting trade-offs. You stop justifying, you stop chasing, and most devastatingly, you stop being available. It is then that what Jung understood as the true process of individuation begins. You begin to separate yourself from what others have projected onto you. You reclaim your boundaries. You remove the magnetic field that held these ties, and then something both magical and terrifying happens. The world panics. The people who were using you without knowing it now accuse you. They say you've become cold, distant, strange. But the truth is something else entirely. You have finally become yourself. This video is not about revenge in the vulgar sense. It is about the most profound rupture of all, the silent liberation. It's about that instant when you realize that to continue existing, you need to disappear from the lives of those who consume you. Let's explore together what Jung discovered about the empath, about the functions, about the shadow hidden in altruism, and most importantly, about what happens when you stop being everyone else's anesthetic and start being your own antidote. This journey will not comfort you, it will reveal you, and the conviction will offer experience, which is different from what we have in you. The tragedy of the empath does not begin with the abandonment, but with the self-abandonment of the empath. Slowly without realizing you signed a contract you never read, a silent, non-verbal agreement in which you give up your soul in monthly installments in exchange for an illusion. You will be loved for what you offer, not for who you are. Jung called this unconscious projection, but here the projection is not a temporary gesture. It becomes a way of life. The empath is no longer someone with their own feelings, their own desires, their own legitimate tiredness. They become a mirror, an emotional container. And most tragically, they accept this as if it were love. Have you noticed how certain relationships function like perfect cogs of psychic codependency? The empath offers unconditional understanding, infinite patience, and constant presence. In return, they receive conditional acceptance based on them maintaining that role. If they dare to get frustrated, to step back, to say no, the contract breaks. And the other person, without understanding why the machine stopped, accuses, "You've changed." But you haven't changed. You just got tired of being a function. Carl Jung pointed this out with unsettling precision. Unilateral adaptation is not growth, it is alienation. The mask we wear to please others ends up suffocating the voice of the soul, and here the deepest wound appears. The empath is not just used by others, they use themselves. They accept this unequal exchange because somewhere very old inside of them exists a distorted but powerful belief that their presence is only valuable if they are useful, that love is won through effort, that acceptance is paid for with sacrifice, that being needed is the closest they will ever get to being loved. This type of bond isn't relational, it's functional. The empath becomes what the other needs to remain unconscious. You avoid conflicts, regulate moods, and anticipate needs. But who regulates the empath? Who holds their silent pain when they collapse at 3 a.m., choked by emotional responsibility they never asked for, but took on as their fate? This is where the shadow begins to whisper. Jung said that the shadow is not only what we repress, but also everything we stop living to be accepted. And in this contract, the empath doesn't just repress anger, tiredness, and frustration. They repress their own existence. How many times did you feel guilty just for needing a break? How many times did you think it was selfish to say, "I can't today"? How many times did you confuse being good with being submissive? It is in this theater of good intentions where the empath, day after day, loses their integrity, and the other person, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes cruelly, takes advantage. But here there is no obvious villain. That's what's most disturbing. It is the passivity, the lukewarm affection, the exchange of compliments that conceals the psychic prison. Jung observed that true freedom begins when we realize we are living a role that others wrote for us. And that realization is almost always accompanied by anguish, anger, in a void so profound that only silence can fill it. This invisible contract is maintained not with words but with silences. Silences that scream, "Be useful or disappear." Silences that say, "Don't complicate things. Don't complain. Don't need." Silences that suffocate. But a moment comes, and you will recognize that instant when something inside the empath breaks. Not with an explosion, but with an absence. You begin to withdraw, to lower the volume, to observe, and for the first time to ask yourself, who am I when I'm not taking care of anyone? That question is a portal. That's where the true individuation begins. The process of becoming who you are and not who the world asked you to be. And it is exactly here that the silent revenge begins. Now there's something you need to understand. The most dangerous enemy isn't outside, it's in your mind. That impulse that makes you explode, that anxiety that paralyzes you, that emotional attachment that weakens you from within. All of that follows a pattern. And until you restructure the mental model that causes it, it will repeat itself over and over again. But there is a way to change that foundation with cold logic, strategic awareness, and emotional retraining exercises. We recorded an exclusive video showing you how to apply that method in a practical way. You can watch it right now. Just scan the code on the screen or click the link in the description or in the first pinned comment. It's not the scream, it's not the outburst, it's not the scandal, it's the silence. What truly hurts isn't the anger, but the absence of an explanation. The empath's silence is a funeral without a wake. It's like entering a house where there was once warmth and now everything echoes with emptiness. Have you been in that place? The place where you were always someone's safe harbor, and you suddenly realize that harbor has become a prison, and that to save yourself you need to leave. But to leave in silence, without justification, without drama, without a final scene. That kind of withdrawal isn't an escape. It's clarity. It's when the empath understands, often too late, that no explanation is enough for someone who only heard what they wanted to, and that the most powerful explanation is absence. Carl Jung called this the withdrawal of mystical participation. The moment you stop unconsciously merging with others, you stop absorbing, compensating, and softening. You stop being the emotional cushion that dampens the falls of someone who never learned to walk on their own. And when you leave, the ground disappears. That's why the empath's silence screams, because it forces the other person to listen to what was unspoken for too long. Codependency, neglect, emotional cowardice. The hard truth that perhaps there was never love, just convenience. The person who always took your presence for granted feels your silence as an unbearable loss. But it's not nostalgia for you. It's withdrawal from the comfort you provided. And what's most cruel is that they don't realize it. They believe you betrayed them, that you become a bitter, cold, and indifferent person. But no, you just stopped offering yourself as an anesthetic. The empath's silence exposes. It exposes the imbalance, the fragile asymmetry, how much the relationship depended on one side giving. Have you noticed how some people only realize your value when you disappear? It's because deep down they didn't know how much you were doing for them, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. You were there holding everything up, invisibly, silently. And now that you've withdrawn, the weight of the structure collapses. Jung said, what you resist persists, but what you ignore weakens. When the empath stops resisting, arguing, and trying to make it work, the cycle of emotional domination begins to crumble, not through aggression, but through starvation. You are no longer feeding the system, and here lies the most disturbing paradox. The more silent the empath becomes, the more noise they cause in the other person's soul. It's not revenge, it's a mirror that reflects the truth. I didn't leave you, I just stopped abandoning myself for you. Some people can't stand that reflection. They need to believe that the problem was you, that you went crazy, that you became selfish, because recognizing the truth would require them to re-examine the entire narrative they've told themselves. But others in silence begin to awaken. They feel the impact, face the void left by your withdrawal, and maybe, just maybe, begin the process of growing. That is the power of silence. It doesn't convince, it reveals. It doesn't argue, it disarms. It doesn't need to prove anything because it is, in itself, proof of exhaustion. The empath who goes quiet is saying, I've explained too much. I've gone beyond what I should have. I've been until I almost disappeared. And now silence is the only language possible. It's at this point that many try to win the empath back. They start sending messages, giving compliments, and apologizing. But don't be fooled. That's not always repentance. Sometimes it's just panic at the loss of the function you served. Jung warned, where love reigns, there is no desire for power, and where power is dominant, love is lacking. The empath's silence disarms that power game, which is why it's so unbearable for those who need to control, manipulate, or depend. You didn't scream, but the world heard. You didn't slam doors, but the echo of your absence reverberated like an earthquake. Because when someone who was always there simply stops being there, reality imposes itself, and it is brutal, but it's also liberating. Because in that silence, you didn't get lost. You found yourself. It's not just a decision, it's an exhaustion that reaches the soul. A moment when the person can no longer pretend that everything is okay, even when everyone keeps asking for exactly that. The empath's withdrawal isn't strategic or planned. It's organic, almost biological. It's like the body rejecting a toxic substance after years of exposure. The mind may try to justify and rationalize, but the body, the soul, the spirit, they are already screaming, enough. Jung observed that there is a moment on the path of individuation when psychic energy, once turned outward toward others, turns inward. And this is where everything changes. The empath, by nature, has a centrifugal emotional flow. They give, they stretch, they pour themselves out, but there is a point where that movement is reversed, and what was once giving becomes a rescue of oneself. You begin to listen to yourself, something you haven't done in a long time. You begin to notice that in your attempt to ease the pain of others, you accumulated pains you couldn't even name. And then comes the energetic retraction. You stop saying yes automatically. You begin to think before you respond. You take pauses, you say no, you create spaces, and in the eyes of those who are used to you always being available, that sounds like a betrayal. But it isn't. It's breathing. For the first time, you are breathing without guilt. Jung described this process as a return of the libido to the self. Libido here is not in the sexual sense, but as life energy. That energy, once used to support the affections of others, begins to be used to rebuild your own internal ruins, and chaos ensues. Because when the empath reclaims their soul, the system they were holding up begins to collapse. You no longer run after others to solve problems that aren't yours. You no longer emotionally juggle to maintain harmony. You no longer explain yourself. You no longer try to prove your worth, and most dangerously, you let others feel the impact of their own decisions. The soul's withdrawal isn't anger, it's maturity. And that's precisely why it's so disturbing. Imagine someone who for years offered light in dark places and suddenly turns off the flashlight, not out of revenge, but out of the realization that they were always the only one lighting up that space, and that perhaps those around them didn't even care who was holding the light as long as it stayed on. The soul's withdrawal reveals that, and this kind of revelation is destabilizing. Many people begin to despair. They try to manipulate, seduce, promise, and blame, but it is too late. The empath didn't just leave the room, they left themselves. They left the version of themselves that accepted crumbs in exchange for a place at the table. Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And here the empath chooses, perhaps for the first time, to become whole, even if it costs them the superficial affection of those who only knew how to relate to their submissive version. This process, however, is anything but romantic. There is a lot of guilt. There is loneliness. There are relapses because the empath carries within them the compulsion to help. And saying no for the first time can sound cruel. But Jung also warned that authenticity hurts. Being true to yourself requires grieving the idealized image. You need to let the good person, the understanding person, the available person die. And that is heartbreaking, but it also liberates. The soul's withdrawal is the beginning of reconstruction. You start asking questions you used to avoid. What do I like? What do I miss? Who am I without this role as the eternal caretaker? And those questions are dangerous because they open wounds. Wounds that were hiding behind everything is fine. Wounds that were never seen because you were always busy healing everyone else's. But now you finally see yourself, and that changes everything. Those around you perceive the change, even if they can't name it. They feel that something essential has escaped, and they try to rescue, control, and restore. But there is no turning back because the soul, once awakened, does not return to the cage. Have you ever had the feeling that your pain was the only possible path to your freedom? That the only way to discover who you are was by breaking everything you were taught to be? Well, yes. Psychological sovereignty is not born from a noble decision. It is born from sacred exhaustion, from the collapse, from the moment you no longer have the strength to sustain the theater of adaptation. The soul can no longer bear being molded to fit the expectations of others. And when that happens, it's not beautiful. It's visceral. It's like being reborn without anesthesia. Jung called this process individuation. But he warned that it's not about becoming better. It's about becoming whole. And for that, you have to die a little. The empath dies in what made them acceptable. They die in the need for approval, in constant guilt, in the feeling that they are only loved when they are saving someone. And that grief is brutal because you're not just losing others. You're losing the you that existed for others. People called you good, reliable, enlightened. And now when you start saying no, they call you distant, cold, selfish. This is where you realize how much that love was conditioned on your emotional submission, and it hurts. But there is a deep beauty in that pain. It shows you where the lie ends and where your freedom begins. Jung said that authenticity requires the courage to be disagreeable. And for the empath who spent their life being agreeable, that's a profound blow because their entire identity was built on the affection of others. Their self-esteem was glued together with the adhesive of usefulness. And now you need to learn to exist without being needed. Do you know what that means? It means accepting that maybe some people will walk away. It means tolerating the void that is left when you stop explaining yourself. It means enduring the uncomfortable silence between you and those who only sought you out when they needed something. But it also means this: you are finally free. Free to make mistakes, to contradict yourself, to feel anger and not apologize for it, to not have answers, to be human. And for the first time, you begin to experience something rare. Peace that doesn't come from control, but from wholeness. You sit with yourself, look inward, and see wounds you've avoided for years. You see memories of when you learned as a child that love is earned by being useful. You see the face of the person who manipulated you with affection. You see the fear of rejection. You see the desperation to be seen. And yet you remain. You don't run. You don't abandon yourself. You choose yourself. That is sovereignty. Jung knew that this process would drive many people away because someone who loves themselves begins to shine differently. And that shine makes those who only knew how to recognize you in the shadows uncomfortable. But he also said, loneliness does not come from not having people around you. It comes from not being able to express what is essential to you. And it's true, the empath's greatest loneliness was never being alone. It was being surrounded by people and still being misunderstood. Sovereignty, then, is accepting that loneliness as part of the process, not as a punishment, but as fertile ground. It is in that space where new bonds are born with people who see you not as a function, but as a presence. With people who don't need you to sacrifice yourself to be loved. With souls who walk beside you and not on top of you. But until then, the empath will hurt, will think they are wrong, will almost turn back, will be tempted to retreat because the call of the old identity still resonates. Be useful, be good, be kind. But now you know. Being good is not abandoning yourself. Being kind is not silencing yourself. And being useful is not the same as being loved. Authenticity, in the end, is an act of daily courage. It's a silent vow. I refuse to continue being half of myself just to be accepted as a whole. And when that vow is made, the empath becomes sovereign, not by being in control, but by finally belonging to themselves. The darkest revenge is the light of someone who was pushed into darkness and yet returned whole, silent, but now shining in a way that blinds others. The empath's exit is not a dramatic farewell. It's an invisible movement, a change in frequency. You don't see it, you feel it. Suddenly, the one who was always there holding up the emotional structure of the environment is no longer there. And the silence of that absence is deafening. But what few people understand is that the empath doesn't disappear for revenge. They disappear for healing. And that is precisely why their departure hurts more than any fight could. Because they didn't want to leave. They were driven out by subtle disdain, invisibility disguised as affection, the constant demand to be anything but themselves. Carl Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that is exactly what the empath does when they finally stop saving others. They look inward and see what they always avoided. They see the compulsion to fix, the emotional codependency disguised as goodness, the guilt of putting themselves first, and with courage, they decide to transmute. The awakened empath does not scream or accuse. They illuminate, but that light is not gentle. It shows. It shows what the other person didn't want to see. It shows how they took advantage of someone else's love. It shows how they called help what was in reality emotional exploitation. And that's where the true revenge is revealed. It's not about hurting the other person. It's about becoming unattainable to someone who only knew how to manipulate you. You no longer respond in the same way. You no longer vibrate on the same level. You are no longer there, neither physically nor energetically. And that breaks invisible pacts, because the awakened empath no longer offers comfort without reciprocity, no longer gives in without questioning, no longer carries a burden without first asking, is this pain mine? The revenge of the light is this: it doesn't punish, it exposes. It shows that the game only worked while you were not aware of your own worth, and now you know it. You know that you don't need to bleed yourself dry to be loved. You know that empathy without limits becomes self-annihilation. You know that kindness without discernment attracts emotional predators. You no longer need to be a savior. You no longer need to be needed. Now you are, and that is enough. Jung saw the empath's path as an archetypal passage from the wounded healer to the sovereign individual, the one who learned to help without getting lost, the one who learned to feel without absorbing, the one who learned to love without extinguishing themselves. That empath, by stopping their saving, begins to exist. They now inspire instead of caring, provoke instead of softening. They create instead of compensating, and most beautifully, they begin to attract a new kind of presence. People who do not need to be saved, but who want to walk beside them, whole hand in hand, without chains. Their light no longer serves as a lighthouse for someone who insists on staying in the basement. It is a lighthouse for someone who is climbing the stairs, for someone who is tired of running from their own pain. And this is where the greatest transformation happens. The empath who once saw themselves as the one who understands everyone now learns to choose themselves, not with guilt, but with reverence, because they understand that every time they abandon themselves to be accepted, they extinguish a little more of what is most sacred in them, their wholeness. The revenge of the light is this: it is not revenge, it is rebirth. And for someone who only knew how to deal with you in pain, in urgency, and in codependency, this new version of you will be unbearable, not because it's cruel, but because it's clear. Your clarity reveals their confusion. Your peace denounces their chaos. Your presence, now selective, shows how limitless you once were out of fear of being rejected. And now you understand, the person who is offended by your boundaries didn't deserve your infinite. That is the most powerful revenge of all. You kept going, you grew, you lit up, and now whoever wants to get close will have to come whole as well. After all, the empath's exit was never about revenge. It was about survival, about stopping dissolving into others to finally condense into yourself. For a long time, maybe you confused love with sacrifice. Maybe you believed that your presence only had value when you were putting out emotional fires. Maybe you built an entire identity around the idea of being the strong, the sensitive, the one who always understands. But every identity built on self-denial one day collapses. And when that happens, it's not pretty. It's devastating. It's like being in ruins, but paradoxically feeling relief. Because there, among the rubble, you discover that something still exists intact. Your essence, what no one could use, manipulate, or condition. What was always there waiting for the moment you would stop betraying yourself to be accepted. Carl Jung said that you do not achieve enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And perhaps that is exactly what your path represents. You entered the darkness not by choice, but out of loyalty. Loyalty to people, stories, and patterns that never offered you the same in return. But now you have returned, you have crossed the valley and come back with something few can carry: consciousness. Consciousness of your worth, your limits, your pain, and above all, your freedom. You no longer need to justify being sensitive. You no longer have to beg for affection in relationships that demand you to be less. You can simply exist, whole, imperfect, authentic. And that in itself is an act of revolution. Maybe it still hurts. Maybe there will still be relapses. Maybe on days of deep silence you feel nostalgic, not for the people, but for the version of yourself who deluded themselves into being useful. But don't be confused, that's not loss, it's cleansing. You are cleaning up the bonds that demanded your soul in exchange for emotional crumbs. And what remains after that purification is the real opportunity to build something new. No longer relationships based on function, but encounters based on presence. Because now you know, being an empath is not being a martyr, being loving is not being an accomplice to your own annihilation, and being light is not illuminating someone who insists on living in the shadows. The awakened empath doesn't save. They inspire, they move, they transform, and sometimes they leave, not out of contempt, but because they understand that you cannot remain where love requires your destruction. That's the biggest turning point of all. When you understand that you didn't leave the other person, you return to yourself. I remember the first time I left in silence. There were no screams, no fight, just a brief but definitive moment when I looked at the person in front of me and understood. She didn't see me. She only saw what I offered her: comfort, a listening ear, balance. And in that instant, without announcing it, I left. Not physically, but energetically. The presence was still there, but something essential had already gone. That's how I discovered that the most powerful goodbye doesn't need words. All it takes is the silence of someone who got tired of erasing themselves. If you want to know how others achieve that stable mind that nothing and no one can break, click on the link in the description or in the first pinned comment now. The content is available for a limited time. Maybe throughout this video, you have felt something similar. Maybe you remembered relationships where you screamed with gestures and no one listened. Maybe you noticed that your kindness was used as a revolving door. People always come in, but no one ever stays. If this touched you, thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, not with your ears, but with your soul, for walking through this labyrinth between shadow and clarity with me, because I know it's not easy, but I also know you didn't get here by chance. If what you heard gave you chills, welcome. That's your unconscious saying hello. Don't run from it. It is what will save you from continuing to be what others expect instead of being who you truly are. And now, that awkward moment when I ask you to like the video, comment below what tore you apart inside, and subscribe to the channel, because if you've made it this far, it's a sign that you're tired of superficial content. Yes, I know, you hate when someone asks for that at the end, but look at the bright side. It's less invasive than that relative who only shows up to ask for money or advice. And if you're wondering what the heck is going to appear in those recommended videos on the screen, well, I don't know for sure either, but I can guarantee one thing. They were made to make you uncomfortable, to open wounds, or perhaps to start healing them. Don't click if you're too comfortable, but if you're restless, if you feel there's something inside you begging to be seen, read, heard, then go and see what happens when you stop running from yourself. See you there, or inside you, which is sometimes the same place.